Very lucky to have with us today Professor Anthony Long, currently distinguished visiting professor in the philosophy department at HKU after coming to us from the classics department at UC Berkeley. He's very well known for his work on ancient philosophy, and his books include Hellenistic Philosophy, Stoics, Epicureans, Skeptics, and more recently Epictetus, A Stoic and Socratic Guide to Life. And today he's going to present to us on Greek Eudaimonism towards its genealogy and typology.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. I didn't know I was coming here until Thursday last week, and here I am. And it's a great pleasure to experience other parts of Hong Kong, which I haven't done so far. So whatever you think about my remarks, one thing I think you will agree is that everybody is interested in the topic, whatever they think about my remarks. Everybody's interested in the good life, everybody's interested in living well, everyone's interested in human flourishing, everyone is interested in happiness. Of course, the question is how we fill those notions out. And that's something I really want to talk about by focusing on what we call Greek Eudaimonism. It's a bit of a mouthful, that word, but I'll explain why I'm using it rather than just saying Greek ideas of happiness in the beginning of this talk. So basically the structure of the talk will be explaining what I mean by Eudaimonism, making some general remarks about it, some contrasts with some early and modern theories of happiness and successful life, then giving you what I've called a genealogy, which is meaning the sort of history of this idea, how these ideas came about, because some of the ideas will seem quite counterintuitive to many of you. And then in the last part of it, to try and flesh that out a little bit with some remarks about the categories that I've put on this handout, such as the beginning here, the first part of it, where I give some general characterizations of Eudaimonism. At the very end of the handout, I mention 6 key concepts, which will come up again and again. And then in the middle of the handout are some texts, some passages of Greek philosophers that I will talk about in due course. So Greek philosophical ethics, commonly signified by the term Eudaimonism, involves many ideas that are remote from subsequent moral thought in, and this is the way I wrote the talk, I said in Western philosophy, because I don't know any other traditions well enough to say. So if there are interesting points to make about Chinese philosophy or Indian philosophy, then go for it in the discussion. But my focus, of course, is on what I know a bit about. The distinctive and seemingly attractive feature of Eudaimonism is precisely its fusion of morality, meaning by morality attention to another's good, and personal well-being or flourishing or self-interest. The Eudaimonist finds personal well-being or flourishing in her rational adherence to moral norms. She finds that is something that gives her a personal well-being, as represented in such virtuous dispositions as justice, courage, generosity, truth-telling, and promise-keeping. She neither sacrifices morality to her pursuit of happiness, nor discards happiness in order to adhere consistently to morality. Supposing that such a life is feasible, should we, or could we make it, as the Greek philosophers did, our ideal? Now, in this paper, I don't exactly want to make a case for Eudaimonism in the way that some scholars have done for that aspect of it that has come to be called virtue ethics. What I want primarily to do is to show how this theory, Eudaimonism, came into being, its genealogy, and what are its conceptual ingredients, its typology. Eudaimonism challenges, and should challenge our attention as philosophers, because, as I said, it appears to fuse morality and happiness. It seeks to sidestep, or claims to sidestep, the intuitively plausible conflicts between self-interest, my good, and altruism, your good, from my point of view, while at the same time it accommodates moral philosophy's interests in such notions as internal reasons for action, dispositional consistency, and conformity to norms of conduct that go beyond self-centered egoism. At the end of the talk, I will suggest that Eudaimonism's fusing of morality and happiness, though immensely challenging and psychologically appealing to some extent, may be ultimately unsatisfactory, because it requires us to give too little weight to our ordinary humanity. By ordinary humanity, I refer to our fundamental interests and emotional investments in material and bodily well-being, both for ourselves as individuals, as subjects, and for other people, especially those we love. But for now, I want to take a close look at the conceptual ingredients of Eudaimonism and the theory's historical underpinnings. As I understand its essential components, Eudaimonism involves 4 interrelated claims concerning a life that fully satisfies its criteria, and those are set out at the beginning of the handout. First, it's the best human life judged objectively or from the outside, as when we deem a person's life to be thoroughly admirable, an achievement, as good as any life could reasonably get. And I call that the objective success condition. Second, it's the best life judged subjectively or from the inside, as when a person can truthfully say of himself or herself, it's all been worth it, or I've done or I'm doing as well as I could in the circumstances, or I have no regrets. Self-satisfaction or contentment condition. Third, it constitutes consistently positive affect, as expressed in such words as cheerful, optimistic, by fulfilling the long-term aspirations and desires of its subject. We could call that an the emotional well-being condition. And fourth, it serves the interests of the subject's social group by cultivating justice, benevolence, and generosity, and I call that the morality condition. No subsequent ethical theory, in my view, has tried to satisfy all 4 of these conditions so comprehensively. Thus, deontological ethics, starting with Kant in modern times, cannot, I think, guarantee 2 and 3 on the handout. I could say that Kantian agent follows all categorical imperatives, may be living the best human life judged from the outside and serving the interests of his social group, but he isn't necessarily happy. He doesn't necessarily enjoy what he's doing. Utilitarian consequentialism may be thought to fit only 4, that it serves the interests of the subject's social group, unless it's also anchored, as it was, of course, with Bentham originally and Mill in a slightly half-hearted way, to egoistic hedonism. As many have observed, it's impossible to translate eudaimonia by any completely satisfactory modern equivalent, but it does fit happiness in one standard use of that word. So what's that? It encompasses the sense of happiness we express when we say not that I or someone is happy or feeling good just at this moment. Oh, I was feeling good this morning, but now I'm down. What we might call smiley face happiness. What it means, if we call it a theory of happiness, is what we mean when we say that someone is having or has had a happy and good and successful life overall. So scholars sometimes translate eudaimonia by flourishing or faring well, because it transcends the good moods or good feelings or momentary enjoyments that happiness typically signifies in modern English. But I do think that, and most scholars I think have agreed with this, that the closest we can ever get in an English translation is still going to be happiness. And in this paper I'm going to use that term sometimes, but for now I want to use the Greek word eudaimonia to avoid prejudicing the inquiry too much. So there are 4 principal ancient theories of eudaimonism, associated each one with one of the 4 main philosophical schools of ancient Greece: Socratic, Platonic, Aristotelian, Epicurean, and Stoic. We'll come to those later in more detail. From an ancient perspective, these theories are incompatible. Thus, Epicureans identify intrinsic goodness with pleasure and intrinsic badness with pain, just like the Victorian utilitarians. Stoics, by contrast, take pleasure or pain to be ultimately indifferent for eudaimonia, and anticipate Kant in treating reason as the foundation of ethics. Plato, at least in some dialogues, holds moral virtue to be sufficient for achieving eudaimonia, as Socrates may well have done. For Aristotle, on the other hand, a modicum of external and bodily goods are a necessary, though subordinate, requirement. Such differences, and there are many more, between the ancient theories are of great interest, but I'm going to largely ignore them here, because my goal is not a fine-grained account of the distinguishing marks of each ancient theory, but an elucidation of their common features, as I outlined above: objective success, subjective satisfaction, emotional well-being, and morality. What I'm after is a genealogy and typology of eudaimonism treated in terms of its basic theoretical structure. My model for this approach is Henry Sidgwick. In the greatest English book that's ever been written on ethics, The Methods of Ethics, went through about 10 different editions between about 1865 and 1900. There Sidgwick proposed and investigated 3 types of ethical theory, which he called egoism, intuitionism, and utilitarianism. And fascinating book to read, because he favours an ethical theory which undoubtedly avoids the sort of pitfalls of sheer egoism, but in the end he thinks that it's impossible absolutely to justify that. So there's always going to be, in Sidgwick's view, a clash between egoistic hedonism and utilitarianism seen as the sum total of other people's good. If I'm right, eudaimonism should be counted as a 4th theory, not only because it cuts across Sidgwick's trio, it also includes some distinctive features of its own. Now, in emphasising the comprehensiveness of eudaimonism, as I've done already by enumerating these 4 features, I don't think that any modern philosopher could or should simply take over the specifics of any one of the ancient eudaimonist theories, however persuasive we may find them to be at some level. Ethical theory, as I understand it, is bound to be culturally specific to some extent, if it's to suit the social and political conditions of actual societies. I mean, we all believe ought implies can, and I think ethics has to pay attention to that, so I'm not myself sympathetic to the notion that at least there can be a sort of detailed ethical theory that sidesteps the actual facts that the society itself. I had written, from our perspective, philosophers use this dreadful word our or we, especially when I'm out of my Western context. I should certainly say simply, I should say from my perspective, the ancient eudaimonist theories are all vulnerable to the criticism that they pay little or no heed to another's good as construed in terms of what we might call inalienable human rights. The Greeks don't have that concept. They don't acknowledge that social justice requires an equitable distribution of goods and opportunities, and they don't recognise democracy as the fairest political system. What will concern me here is Greek eudaimonism in its historical context. In other words, I want to ask why and how ancient philosophers arrived at the amazing idea, put succinctly by Plato's Socrates, and this is in passage 1, that nothing can harm a good man, either in life or in death, and his fortunes are not neglected by the gods. And Socrates is saying this, you remember, when, as he believes, and of course as Plato and many others have since believed, that he had been put on trial totally unjustly and is going to be condemned to death. He's been condemned to death at the point that he says this, but he says it nonetheless. Or to cite Aristotle, who is usually less, extreme in his thoughts, passage 2, the man who's truly good and wise, again, a man, I'm afraid, Greek philosophers do tend to talk in a somewhat gendered way, though very often we can ignore that and should say something like the human being, but here I think he has to say man, the man who is truly good and wise bears all the chances of life becomingly and always makes the best of circumstances. And if that is the case, the eudaimon man can never become wretched aphlios, never. Although he will not reach blessedness if he meet with fortunes like those of Priam, who, remember, lost his 50 sons and daughters and his city of Troy. Aristotle's position was later clarified by Aristotelians as the claim that virtue is always sufficient for happiness, but not sufficient without bodily and external goods for the greatest happiness. What in essence explains these striking claims, the one of Socrates and the one of Aristotle, is the notion that human well-being, or as the Greeks would say, well-living, eudain, depends fundamentally neither on external circumstances, one's own or other people's, nor on the state of one's body, but depends instead on the optimal state of what they called one's soul. Mind, we could say, perhaps a little easier in English. This expression, the optimal state of one's soul or mind, needs a lot of unpacking. Let me just say at this stage that it signifies a mindset such that one's cognitive, emotional, and ethical dispositions are consistently shaped by reasoning on the basis of the specific philosophical school's fundamental principles. To take an example, an Epicurean's achievement of eudaimonia requires that you accept a non-teleological, non-theological cosmology. You say, gods have nothing to do with the way the world is set up, or my life. The conviction there's nothing fearful about death. The assessment of the greatest pleasure as absence of mental pain. And the interentailment of pleasure and virtuous character. On the basis of these and analogous rational dispositions, I'm speaking now generally, flourishing persons premise eudaimonia primarily or exclusively, the primarily or exclusively is open to disagreement, on themselves. That is, their characters, values, and states of consciousness, as distinct from material things and circumstances that are outside their own power. That is to say, they premise their well-being, which is going to include the well-being of their social group, on inner rather than outer conditions. Greek ethics relies fundamentally on a three-part distinction between external, bodily, and mental goods, with priority assigned to the latter, mental. The difference between market capitalism and the acquisitiveness of the Gucci store or the Saint Laurent could not be greater. How and why did the eudaimonistic outlook arise? So now we get to history. The pre-philosophical meaning of eudaimonia is good fortune or prosperity, conceived precisely in objective material terms that everyone today takes for granted. In what may be the word's earliest occurrence, in something called the Homeric hymn to Athena, the goddess Athena is requested to give the poet and his audience fortune and eudaimonia. This word eudaimonia is a compound of the adverb eu, meaning well, and daimon, from which we get the word demon, but it doesn't have this negative connotation in Greek, it just means divinity, and extending here into the meaning of fate or fortune. Most literally then, in its earliest usage, eudaimonia signifies a God-favoured condition, hence good fortune, as when a farmer's crops and livestock prosper. Health, wealth, renown, a flourishing family and community, these are characteristic indicators of eudaimonia in ordinary Greek usage, before philosophy took an interest in the term. And I wouldn't think it would be far off to suppose that those are notions of flourishing that might be thought to be an anthropological universal, whether it's China today, or ancient Britain, or New Guinea, or wherever. It was no doubt assumed that persons with a flourishing family and community who excel in health, wealth, and renown are happy, meaning content and joyful, rather than restless or sad. But those psychological connotations are not implicit in the term itself. Traditionally, eudaimonia signified simply success in the way we say that a successful person is doing well. Now, the gods of Greek mythology were notoriously erratic in the favours they dispensed. Therefore, doubts were frequently expressed about people's prospects for achieving eudaimonia, or, if it was achieved, one's prospects for maintaining it. And so, in Greek literature's most powerful expression of global pessimism, where the chorus in Sophocles' play Oedipus say, "Count no human being, eudaimon," the chorus reflect, having seen Oedipus go from the pinnacle of success to the catastrophic change once he realizes that he's actually been the murderer, unbeknown to himself, of his father and wedded his own mother. They say we should count nobody eudaimon. It's not something that can ever be achieved. It was just an illusion and a parrot, because it always can just disappear, just like that. Oedipus, after his downfall, as Sophocles represents so movingly in his play, shows admirable moral qualities, shows fatherly concern for his daughters, he takes responsibility for what he unknowingly did, he insists on undergoing exile for his country's sake. Greek tragedy, as Aristotle would later observe in his Poetics, rests on the notion of suffering that is undeserved, not merited by the sufferer's actions or character. That's what makes it tragic. But in the earliest Greek poetry, we also find suggestions that people's external success or disaster is merited by their actions or their character, and that people often bring disaster on themselves, irrespective of the actions of gods. The Homeric hero Achilles brings wretchedness on himself and his social group by uncontrollable anger and resentment based on pride. In contrast, the Homeric Odysseus, after enormous travels and troubles, recovers his home, his wife, and his kingdom. Without the aid of his patron goddess Athena, he would not have succeeded, no doubt, but Homer also persuades us that the hero's eventual success is primarily due to what he calls his much-enduring character, his intelligence, and at the end, his ability to let the pursuit of long-term goals prevail over his immediate feelings. So we can see, I think, if you contrast Achilles and Odysseus, we can see why the philosophers, when they come to try and internalize eudaimonia in the way I've started to tell you about, you can see why Odysseus was kind of seen as a pre-philosophical hero, because he, unlike his crew, who were all enthralled to their feelings and emotions, was able to somehow prevail through his character and his wits. Now, in this earliest Greek poetry then, we sometimes find an optimistic but rather naive connection between human flourishing in material terms and adherence to what we might call moral norms. But the uncertainty of that connection was so obvious that, to repeat what I said a moment ago, it stimulated the emergence of tragedy as a great dramatic art form. As we all still know, the wicked or the foolish often do well in the world, and the good or the wise often come to grief. If you take external prosperity to be the measure for judging a good and successful life, then we can understand the popularity of statements such as count no one happy, or at least count no one happy until they're dead, because you don't know what's going to happen. Sophocles' Athenian audience, especially those who experienced the city's great downfall at the end of the Peloponnesian War, which went on for 30 years and destroyed the dominance of Athens in the Greek world, they must have felt the full force of such sayings. Now, some of that audience probably heard Socrates a few years later, when he was on trial as an enemy of the state, say the following to the members of the jury, which is the other part of that first passage on the handout. Are you not ashamed, talking to the jury, that while you care to acquire as much wealth as possible, with honour and glory as well, You take no care or thought for prudence or truth or the best possible state of your soul. And he goes on, all I do is go about persuading you not to care for your bodies or for your wealth so intensely, it doesn't say not to care for them at all, but not to care for them as intensely as for the greatest possible excellence of your souls. It's not wealth that produces virtue, but rather it's from virtue that wealth and all other goods for human beings accrue. Socrates doesn't declare himself in this context to be eudaimon, but here and elsewhere in Plato, he asserts that the death sentence passed on him, totally unjust though it was in his eyes, will do him no harm. He also asserts that in his own judgment he's lived as well both objectively and subjectively as any human being could reasonably desire. Remember, in the Phaedo, in the great dialogue Phaedo, when all the friends are there, and Socrates is about to drink the hemlock, and they're saying, how will we manage without you, Socrates? How will we do? And he's just dismisses it all. He says, well, the real philosopher is going to be somebody who's much more concerned about the state of his soul than about the length of his life. Socrates' serenity and confidence in his last days must have profoundly shocked the majority of his fellow countrymen, because they were accustomed to evaluating a successful life, as we today of course still are to a great extent, in the material terms that Socrates explicitly and emphatically rejects, especially when he declines to plead for his life. The more reflective among them must also have seen in Socrates an embodiment of the radically converse values that he prescribes to them, as we see in that passage, downgrading honour and wealth, upgrading prudence and truth. All of these attitudes being presupposed by prioritising the excellent state of the soul rather than the body. For understanding the genealogy and typology of Greek Eudaimonism, I regard Plato's Apology as the proof text. Plato's subsequent dialogues and Stoic philosophy, in which ethical excellence becomes the only essential condition of a truly good and flourishing life, are the most obvious developments from this Socratic beginning. But Aristotle and Epicurus, though less restrictive in their conception of human values, would hardly have focused their own ethics on the excellent or virtuous state of the soul without the example and influence of Socrates. To take the measure of that concept as it developed, we need to move beyond Socrates himself. By way of a brief transition, I want just to spend a moment or two on Herodotus, whose great work on the Greek victories over the Persian Empire appeared when Socrates was about 45 years old. So let's enter Herodotus's history at the point where the Athenian statesman called Solon is answering the fabulously wealthy king Croesus of Lydia, who has asked Solon to name the happiest of men, the most eudaimon. Croesus had expected and hoped that Solon would choose himself on account of his wealth. But instead, Solon gave the prize to an obscure Athenian called Tellus, T-E-L-U-S. Solon gives 4 reasons for this assessment. First, the prosperity of Tellus's community. Second, his being survived by fine sons and by grandchildren. Third, his having only moderate wealth. And last, his dying gloriously in battle, which his fellow citizens recognised by giving him a public funeral. This is Solon's notion of the happiest of men. As readers of this tale, we are meant to contrast the completed life of Tellus with the incomplete life of King Croesus, who will soon be defeated in war, lose his great wealth, and become the slave of the Persian king, and hence a paradigm of tragic reversal of fortune. When we analyse Solon's recipe for eudaimonia, we find it consists of 3 components. First, personal, familial, and civic success, as indicated by lasting prosperity and honour, moderate wealth, and ethical excellence. Tellus, we are implicitly told, achieved everything a man could reasonably desire. His life was complete, it lacked for nothing essential in material terms, and it manifested virtue in the form of public service and courage. Solon in Herodotus proceeds to award a second prize for eudaimonia to a pair of athletic brothers who, like Tellus, he says, were only moderately wealthy. The startling thing in Solon's second example is that these brothers died very young in answer to their mother's prayer. To acknowledge their achievement in pulling her in an ox cart to the temple of Hera, because I guess the horse had fallen ill, or the cow, or whatever, an exploit which had won them and their mother great honour, the mother asked the goddess to give them the best human fortune. She answered her prayer by causing the woman's 2 sons to fall asleep in the temple and never wake up. Although the 2 brothers, unlike Tellus, died young, this paradigm is essentially the same as his, in requiring eudaimonia to be lifelong and crowned rather than lost by the circumstances of death. Once again, its constituents include public and familial renown, only moderate wealth and moral virtue, here manifested in the brothers' service to their mother and the goddess. Here a startling response to the mother's prayer, "Give my sons the best thing possible," recognises what we might call qualitative completeness as a condition for eudaimonia and dissociates that from having a long life. Taken together, Solon's 2 examples might seem to shift the conditions for eudaimonia in a Socratic direction by their emphasis on moderation and ethical virtues, as distinct from the purely external and quantitative criteria of good fortune. I think that's importantly true, but only to a limited extent. The examples tell us nothing about the mental dispositions of the persons, their reasons, or desires, or feelings. For all we know, Tellus and the 2 brothers could have been manic depressives. As for lifelong eudaimonia, the 2 brothers may have lived too briefly for misfortune to strike. In other words, Tellus of Athens, who did live to maturity, was fortunate as well as being admirable. Solon's examples fit 2 of the 4 conditions with which I began this paper: objective success, the admirable life as looked at from outside, and morality or social virtue, serving the interests of your group. But they don't address the second condition, subjective satisfaction, and the third, which I call the emotional well-being condition. Solon's examples have nothing to say or imply about Socratic moral psychology, the conditions of the soul that are necessary to assure eudaimonia, independently from luck and external contingencies. So as I now turn towards the end of my paper, I want to start from 3 citations which are on the handout to illustrate the eudaimon life, starting with Aristotle. So this is passage 2, after the bit that's in bold, which we looked at before. He says, "If we were to keep pace with his fortunes, we should often call the same man eudaimon and again wretched, because after all, every human being is going to have ups and downs in a certain sense. Success or failure in life doesn't depend on the gifts of fortune," says Aristotle, "but human life needs these as mere additions, while virtuous activities, what he calls excellent activities of soul, or their opposites, are what constitute eudaimonia, or the reverse. No human function has so much permanence as virtuous activities. Durability will belong to the eudaimon person, and he'll be eudaimon throughout his life. For always, or by preference to everything else, he'll be engaged in virtuous action, and he'll bear the chances of life most nobly and altogether decorously, if he's truly good and foursquare beyond reproach." Note Aristotle's emphatic distancing of eudaimonia from fortune, his taking its essence to be virtuous activities of the soul, and his interest in its durability and permanence. So no smiley face up and down there. Now Epicurus in what is called a letter he wrote to a friend called Letter Typology. What produces the pleasant life, remember that Epicurus is a kind of hedonist, what produces the pleasant life is sober reasoning, which tracks down the causes of every choice and avoidance, and which banishes the opinions that beset souls with the greatest confusion. Of all this, the beginning and the greatest good is prudence, the natural source of all the remaining virtues. Teaches the impossibility of living pleasurably without living prudently, justly, and honourably, and the impossibility of living prudently, honourably, and justly without living pleasurably. So there's an interentailment, according to Epicurus, between pleasure and the virtues. They're inseparable from one another. Thirdly, I take what I've called Stoic eudaimonia, as expressed first in passage 4 there. Well, it doesn't matter which way round we take these. I'll take the last one first, Cicero on Stoic happiness. It's Cicero giving his own report of the Stoics. It's a peculiar characteristic, he says, of the wise man, that he does nothing he could regret, nothing against his will, does everything honourably, consistently, seriously, and rightly, refers everything to his own judgment, and stands by his own decisions. I can conceive nothing that's happier than this. According to the Stoics, the ultimate good, living consistently in accordance with nature, is not only the wise man's proper function, but also in his power. It necessarily follows, he says, that the happy life is in the power of the man who has the ultimate good in his power. So the wise man's life is always happy. And then the fourth passage on the handout, the one above that, Seneca, what is a happy life? Peacefulness and constant tranquility. Loftiness of mind will bestow this, and consistency that holds fast to good judgment. How are these things reached? If all of truth has been seen, if orderliness, moderation, and seemliness are preserved in actions, and a will that's guiltless and kindly, focused upon reason and never deviating from it, as lovable as it's admirable. The wise man's mind should be such as befits God, where we have an emphasis here on absolute autonomy, consistency, rationality, virtue, and tranquility. Now, of course, these ethical theories I've been just very crudely illustrating here are much too complex to do more than just pick out some of the salient concepts. I simply cite them to give you a little bit more of a fleshed out notion of what I call the typology of eudaimonism, and I'll just sort of run over that very rapidly in my final remarks here. So if you look at the bottom where I've called the 6 features of eudaimonia, I'm going to just talk about them very briefly. Autonomy, meaning by autonomy the notion that our flourishing, happiness, well-being, success in life is largely or entirely dependent on ourselves, our own decisions and outlook and feelings, and not on the world outside. This is, of course, perhaps the most striking departure of eudaimonism from all those traditional notions that I talked about early on. The notion that our happiness, our prosperity, our flourishing is dependent on the way the world treats us, on fortune. If happiness is in our power as individual persons, then we have to have access to a type of goodness that's better than anything luck would deliver to us, and something that's not vulnerable to misfortune, which therefore points to the soul or mind as the primary locus of happiness. It also points to a psychology that equips persons to take charge of their beliefs, desires, and emotions. The second feature is something, again, very unfamiliar, of course, in our modern cultures, what the Stoics and others like to call godlikeness. All I will want to say about that here is that to compare somebody to a god in ancient Greek was to liken that person to the most flourishing and effective and best thing possible. And Greek philosophers liked to say that the disposition that they regard as crucial to the achievement of happiness gives one this kind of godlike quality. Rationality is the third one I've cited here. We see that Socratic feature in many of the philosophies that I've been describing. We see it, for example, in the Aristotelian idea that the virtues are balancing acts between excess and deficiency. The courageous person, in other words, is not sort of who dashes out into battle no matter what, but he's somebody who doesn't flinch at the same time when that's the appropriate thing to do. We find it in the Epicurean hedonistic calculus, distinguishing between necessary, natural, and vain desires. And we find it in the Stoics' understanding that eudaimonistic values are not functions of circumstances, they're not things that happen to us, but rather on the rational use we make of circumstances. The fourth one here I've called emotional balance. It's again a very traditional notion in Greek culture, sometimes expressed in the idea of nothing in excess, the notion of moderation, not going too far, not falling short, balance again. It's again one that the Greeks, of course, had numerous examples in their mythology of people who came to grief by over-assertion. The fifth one here, what I've called independence from externals. It fits in, of course, very much with the notion of autonomy, but it's not quite the same thing. Autonomy is focusing on your own, as it were, the kind of legislative notions that you deliver to yourself, whereas this one is simply saying that external things are not the critical condition of your flourishing in life, but rather how you make use of them. And finally, I'd say tragedy had maintained that there's no necessary link between morality, prosperity, virtue, and happiness. The philosophical tradition challenges that by trying to internalize well-being and morality. So it was a big project, a very fascinating one, but now I come to finally just to mention a few objections. In Epicureanism and Stoicism, the best mindset is typically expressed in negative terms: being undisturbed, being unimpeded. These terms register the notion that philosophical eudaimonia, thanks to its rational foundations, is not subject to change in response to external circumstances. You remain in control, so to speak. Epicureans and Stoics were even said to be happy on the rack. Aristotle thought that was nonsense, but he doesn't allow even terrible catastrophe, as we've seen, to mar the good man's eudaimonia to the point of making him wretched. And here, I think, is the principal weakness of eudaimonism as a viable moral theory. It was one thing to make material goods or misfortunes indifferent or relatively unimportant for the agent's happiness, for my happiness. But all the theories I've been considering include benevolence and generosity among the social virtues. Now, recipients of benevolence and generosity are made better off, because otherwise how would that be benevolent or generous? Because they're given things that directly improve their quality of life, irrespective of how they themselves judge such things. It's hard to see how someone could be rationally motivated to give things to others that will contribute nothing of substance to their happiness. At the beginning of the paper, I observed that eudaimonism is vulnerable to the criticism that it bypasses the equity issues that are central to a modern theory of justice, such as Rawls. I think similar objections are going to apply to any theory that attempts comprehensively to fuse and integrate morality, in the sense of attention to another's good, with subjective satisfaction and emotional well-being. The promise of eudaimonism is a maximally successful life in which all my reasonable desires are fulfilled. But surely those desires will include aspirations for my loved one's happiness as well as my own, and I'll do my best to bring about that happiness. But this further happiness, however we define it, because it's the happiness of others, is outside my power to assure. It's outside the reach of any virtuous activities I may perform on behalf of others. My loved ones fall sick, say, or they suffer some other misfortune, or they're unable to subscribe to eudaimonism because they have a different conception of happiness. Their plight troubles me greatly. I try my best to help, but to no avail. I'm devastated, not on my account. I can perhaps say I'm doing fine, just thinking of my own life, but I'm devastated on their account. Even as I sympathize with them and show compassion, I feel wretched. Epictetus, I should say, at one point, is a very, very interesting representative of Stoicism and a very, I think, very fascinating figure to read. But he will also say things like, it does no harm when you are kissing your child to say, tomorrow you may be dead. Now, that is a stark kind of realism, which at a certain point we can understand. I mean, that, yes, get real, we're all going to die, anything can happen to anybody anytime, but nonetheless, there is a certain sense that you're trying to almost wall yourself off from what happens to others. And that, it seems to me, even though he will say it again in another context, when somebody is suffering, you can put your arms around them and you can weep with them, but don't weep inwardly. I think this is a very serious problem, because as one feels about others and their sufferings, surely it's intuitively obvious that this will be a blemish on my emotional equilibrium. Yet the good eudaimonist cannot become wretched or suffer any incurable harm. He cannot become a man of sorrows. In that case, if I'm not mistaken, eudaimonism, for all its strengths and interesting fusions and stuff that I've talked about, it involves, in the end, a kind of disquieting egoism, an egoism of emotional detachment. I cannot maintain my emotional well-being, my happiness, if you will, if I permit your suffering to pierce my soul. And if that's right, eudaimonism will not be fully compatible with any intuitive understanding of humanity. That's it for today.
Field questions for you?
Yes, of course. I'm getting a whole lot. So, shall I field my own?
No, I'll field them
okay,
for you.
yes.
That's probably the easiest. Paisley, what else?
Thank you. Thank you for that fascinating lecture. I was intrigued by the notion that you've labeled qualitative completeness.
Yes.
So this is just a request to hear more about it, and perhaps as just a sort of catalyst. How does it connect with the way in which a life ends?
Yes.
Because you have as number 3, fulfilling the long-term interests and desires of the subject. Of course, long-term is ambiguous and vague. How long can the term be? And so the question of what's the right way to die, and at least on one kind of, and a couple of the examples that you gave in connection with this qualitative completeness were cases where there was very much an external termination, not a matter of internalization or self-control, whereas one might think that perhaps suicide, rational suicide, might be at least a prototypical form in which this qualitative completeness might occur.
Well, of course.
Looking forward to the Romans, I guess.
Yeah, I'm sure, as you know, Stoic philosophers, I mean, there were different views, as there are obviously in modern societies, about the appropriateness of suicide and euthanasia and so forth. But the Stoics did think that in extremis, and then you could ask, well, what would that extremis mean? What they call the wise person, it would be an option to take your own life. I think the extremis conditions would be that life was such that you could no longer, the circumstances become so dire that you could no longer live any kind of life that you could regard as a sort of human life. I could give an actual historical example of someone who tried who did something like this. There was an American. He was actually the vice presidential candidate when Ross Perot, the third party candidate, stood for about 20 years ago. And this man's name is Jim Stockdale. He was an American war hero who had got shot down in Vietnam and was put in solitary confinement for several years, and had studied Epictetus as a student at Stanford.
Okay.
I got to know him later because he was at the Hoover Institute, and he wrote a book called Courage Under Fire, in which he basically says it was that ancient philosophy of Stoicism that was the only thing that could kept him going through a great many privations. He said it's not pain, it's not sort of the foulness of a prison cell that becomes the greatest challenge in those conditions. It's keeping any sense of your own self-worth, any sense of dignity. But interestingly, at the very last moment, he did decide that he couldn't stake it any longer. He managed somehow to attempt suicide, but by some incredible coincidence, some might say providence, it was the day the Americans signed an armistice. He was found, he was patched up, and he lived to tell the tale. Now, but sorry about being so anecdotal there, but the point about qualitative and quantitative, of course, when I talk about qualitative completeness, I'm very much trying to set up a contrast by saying, it's a kind of utilitarian contrast, really. It's saying it's not how many goods you have, how many years you have, etc. It's what you do with what you have, and this notion of completeness is one that Aristotle really, I think, was the first of the ancient moral philosophers really to really emphasize. I mean, he says very clearly in book 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics that a condition for the good life is that it be complete. But he clearly doesn't mean that sort of it has to be 70 years. He doesn't, I think, rather wisely define what he takes completeness to be, but I think we can flesh it out as meaning that you wouldn't, if you were to die at that moment, so to speak, there wouldn't be a sense of fundamentally unfulfilled desires, other gaps in your life. Everything that you could reasonably hope for and aspire to had somehow come into that recipe. And the other ancient philosophers who came next followed that very, very strongly. That neither the Epicureans nor the Stoics have any attempt to quantify the goods that are requisite to having this eudaimon life. The conditions are always going to be put in terms of, to the extent to which you have understood your circumstances, made the best use of those, etc., etc. So I think, there's an awful lot we could think about sociologically here. After all, we live in a world today, where healthcare and all kinds of other medical discoveries and so forth have enabled people, at least people in the more developed world, to have quite strong expectations about longevity and so forth. And we obviously, modern governments think that's something that quite rightly that they should promote and so forth. So there's a gap here, I think, and it may well be that this would be not so much a philosophical analysis, but a sociological, historical analysis of these views that I've been presenting would draw attention to the vulnerability of life in those conditions, to an extent which, again, that then just have something like, the Philippines typhoon, you have tsunamis, you have Katrina. I mean, disasters continue to happen to people, but obviously they're not. There is a difference, perhaps in expectation now. So the control of circumstances being seen here as a function of one's, capacity to be understanding about the condition, the reasonable conditions of life, something like that. Yeah. Sorry.
I was thinking about your first objection to Eudaimonism.
Yes.
Which, if I understood correctly, was something like this, namely, among the virtues, there are benevolence,
yes.
generosity, it's hard to understand how. I mean,
Yes.
they seem to portray some concern for the conditions of life, the quality of life of others.
Yes.
Seems to threaten this condition of autonomy also, or independence from externals. So
Yes.
There seems to be a tension between these components of eudaimonia. I was wondering if one possible response could be that, apart from maybe a very radical Nietzschean response or something to just reevaluate the virtues, but a less radical response, well, it could be to understand this quality of life of others as a precondition for eudaimonia. So not, if you understand what I mean, so the difference between being made a component of eudaimonia, rather than being a component, a precondition of it. So in order for someone to obtain this state, both the actor, agent and recipient of the benevolence would have to be maybe would have to enjoy a certain quality of life, and then they can obtain this state of eudaimonia free from concern for these other things. So it's like health. Health also depends on external things.
Right, right.
But it's also a precondition of maybe all these other things like emotional balance and so on.
Right. So, interesting what you're saying there. I mean, is the thought that you're not really the question of material benefits and health and all those kind of things are not seen as part of the project.
Yes.
They're sort of preconditions.
Yes, yes.
I mean, that is an interesting, very interesting remark, I think. I mean, again, if we think of Aristotle, Aristotle seems, when he writes his ethics, to be presupposing, well, he's writing for free-born males rather than a total population. I mean, the slaves are really, outside this kind of context. Although he will often talk in generalizing terms about human beings, he nonetheless, I think, is presupposing a certain degree of affluence, a certain degree of, of stability, and so you could sometimes think that the virtues and the prescriptions for happiness that he's talking about are taking those for granted. I think is that perhaps your point, and that this might help to explain why there isn't more concern for my equilibrium, my emotions, my happiness to be radically affected by something that happens to you. That could be so. I think that's an interesting, very interesting reflection. I think whether it would, and it's yes, of course, it's definitely true that all of these philosophers are. I mean, they're living in a way which is sort of elite compared with the total mass of people. It's interesting that Epicurus, who was himself a rather wealthy man, provided this estate that he had, which is called the garden, as a place where his followers could live, and I think there was a kind of farm there, and so in a sense he's providing them with the material well-being, and but it's striking that the sort of conditions of life that promoted modern socialist, reforms in, say, think of the kind of Britain in the early 19th century and the social reformers and the people, the abolitionists of slavery and so forth. It's very hard to think, there don't seem to be equivalents in the ancient world for that kind of reforming project. Why that might be so, were conditions actually rather better than they were, let's say, in the slums of London or the galley ships? Who knows? I mean, I think that's just a very interesting point. I'd like to think more about it.
I'm more interested in your third ingredient of the
Yes.
eudaimonia, the emotional well-being.
Yes.
Maybe two very quick questions. First, given the possible divorce between objective success
Yes.
and subjective satisfaction,
Yes.
is this third one is already a synthesis or somehow a combination of both objective and subjective, because the long-term, so-called the long-term interests and desires, definitely it's not just judged from any, momentary, subjective, perspective,
Right.
right?
Yes.
But it includes.
Yes.
Let's use the Ulysses example.
Yes.
When Ulysses both want his safely back home,
Yes.
but also want to enjoy the silence.
Yes.
Let's suppose this is a heavenly.
Yes.
Nobody ever, but no human ever. But it's momentary, but it may ruin his life.
Yes.
But he wants to achieve both.
Yes.
Right? We can even imagine the repeated silence, cases. So somehow here, the first one is whether it's already somehow preempt the objective, subjective issue. Yeah.
Yes.
The second
Yeah.
one, getting back to the Ulysses example, also you mentioned the living consistently. In what way Ulysses' choice of binding himself to the mast and somehow both enjoy the silence as well as the long term?
Yes.
Is that more consistent, more ideal case of living eudaimonia, or its risk actually certain? It's like already risk something. It's violating certain prudence. What's your response to that?
Well, I mean, I think your first, I'd like to think very much about that point about Ulysses. I mean, I think the general point, I think, is a very well taken point, because obviously when you're kind of typology like this, you're trying to analyze certain ingredients, but then it may seem as if these are being somehow thought of as, completely independent of one another, and that I think would be a mistake. So that I think in pulling them out like this, I partly want to do so in order to draw certain contrasts with these other modern theories. So I mean, if you take the deontological theory, and of course it's a great mistake to think that Kant didn't think that people should be interested in their own or other people's happiness. Of course he thought that happiness was a wonderful thing. He just didn't think that it should be a consideration when you are asking, what ought I to do? And when I'm asking the question, what ought I to do, and coming up with answers to that question, those answers should abstract from anything that might give me subjective satisfaction. In other words, the rational will would say, I made a promise, and it's categorically incumbent on a human being, insofar as we're rational beings, to keep promises. But I don't want to. I don't want to. Well, that's irrelevant. That's irrelevant. It's the moral quality of the requirement is an independent thing from anything that would relate to my desires or feelings in those other ways. And this does not, I don't think any ancient philosopher wants to accept that view. But of course there is something intuitively plausible about what Kant is doing, because it does seem as if, human beings we often are faced with conditions of a tremendous conflict. What we do think would be pleasing or desirable or whatever it may be, and duty. So there's a dilemma there. I think an ethical theory is always going to have to try to handle this. Can we fuse the emotional desire, satisfaction aspect of our lives and our obligations, if you will, or do they have to be pulled apart? And so that was, I think, partly why I put it that way. But I think what you were sort of pushing me in a direction which I would like to go, which is that in looking at a virtuous character or a good character or a character of someone who satisfies Greek eudaimonism, there would have to be a kind of seamless quality to all this. And yes, you could say that my emotional satisfaction is also coming from some kind of sense of objective success, or the objective success aspect is feeding into this other. So I totally agree with that. As to Ulysses and his mast, I don't know. That's a very interesting question. I mean, how to think about that. Push it back to you. I mean, what do you feel about him?
He's definitely not stoic, you know.
Oh no, absolutely not. No.
So I
mean,
admire Ulysses. If we can achieve both, why not?
I think,
but it has the risk. Also rational,
but I mean,
dynamic rationality.
But I mean, the very fact that he was somebody that was used as a mythological example of all kinds of things. So you could say that he's sufficiently. I mean, he wants to hear the sirens, but he knows it would be totally dangerous to hear them. So he's being prudent in a certain sense, but at the same time, he wants to do that. Sure.
Just a quick note. My advisor even want to go further. He said Ulysses binding himself to the mast is still a cost, because binding himself to the mast, all the rest crew,
yes,
of the heirs, still have a potential cost. A really truly rational, resolute chooser, you didn't need the external binding. You bind yourself by committing to a specific plan. But that's too far for me. It's too dangerous. You commit to something, but you can predict yourself will defect at that moment.
Yeah. I mean, I'm tempted also to bring up someone like the Bernard Williams stuff about moral luck. Where you sort of you recognise that something you may be doing might have bad consequences, but on the other hand, you gamble on it working out, because if it did work out, it would just be so wonderful. And I think what Odysseus is going to say to you, Ulysses is going to say to you, because he made it home, by God, those sirens sounded good. I'm really glad I could hear those sirens. It was worth it.
Okay, so I have two comment questions. The first one, when you talk about Aristotle, you gave us the Nicomachean Ethics 110,
yes,
which has this priam, but priam is also in 1.9, right?
Yes.
A little before, and it is very different there. And
yes,
I never
is,
understood really what Aristotle wants with this 1.9.
Yes.
He says we need a complete life, since many changes occur in life and all manner of chances. And the most prosperous may fall into great misfortunes in old age, as is told of Priam in the Trojan cycle. And one who has experienced such chances and has ended wretchedly, no one calls happy. So this contradicts what you said here, right? Because now Priam has ended wretchedly, and it doesn't matter whether he was virtuous or not. And no one would call him happy. So you try to say that virtue is sufficient for happiness, but not for greatest happiness. But in 1.9 he seems to say the opposite.
Well, I agree. There is a real problem of consistency there, I think. I think that's true. I mean, he does seem to, definitely says what you just said about that in 1.9, and at the same time he says here, the Eudaimon man can never become wretched, though he will not be blessed if he meets with fortunes like those of Priam. So I think I was taking it, and maybe that's, you could object to that, maybe I was taking it that Aristotle is treating Priam as somebody who was a virtuous person. He does suffer this terrible misfortune, so of course you have to say that in that sense his life ended up disastrously. I thought he was saying that actually he didn't become that Priam himself, but perhaps that's wrong. So you think that he's simply using Priam in the previous ways to carry that forward, what he said in the 1.9 about Priam.
Yeah, there seems to be a contradiction, right? It doesn't make sense really, the 1.9. I mean, your interpretation is nicer, because how can you have a concept of eudaimonia which depends so much on luck, right? You can have your whole life lived in a eudaimon style, and then suddenly, because the end is unhappy, you lose eudaimonia completely.
Yes.
You have never been eudaimon. This doesn't make much sense.
I think there is an inconsistency, and I'm very grateful for you for bringing that out. I mean, I think that Aristotle's got a bit of a dilemma here. He doesn't want to sort of anticipate the complete Stoic idea that no matter what, if you've only got wisdom and all the virtues that go along with that, then anything can happen to you and you're still totally happy. He thinks that's intuitively probably absurd. On the other hand, he still wants to say that the sovereign ingredient in happiness is this quality of mind and soul and virtue, and that's isn't something that's going to be wrecked by misfortune. So I think he's got 2 points of view here. I mean, I think the 1.9 he's trying to say, having what he's done. If we go back further before 1.9, he's come up with this view that, well, how are we to understand eudaimonia? Well, we should understand eudaimonia by recognizing that human beings have what he calls a distinctive function, which is to cultivate a rational life, and that's going to be the most important ingredient in happiness. And then he sort of says, but eudaimonia will also, there'll have to be some other things as well. There'll have to be a certain modicum of external benefit. And I think, of course, he says that not only because he thinks it would be sort of intuitively absurd to say that if somebody had lost everything that they could still be eudaimon. I think he thinks that certain of the virtues require certain material goods. I mean, how could you be generous if you had nothing to give, and so forth. But then I think he's having said that there has to be some measure of external goods. Then he comes to the passage you talked about. So yeah, I can't solve that problem, and maybe I should have put the 1.9 in there as well. So, yeah.
And the second point.
Yes.
Do we have time?
Yeah.
Well, it's kind of either you or Derek for the last.
Okay.
I didn't ask him very well.
Sure? Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so very briefly, the second point. Generally, in what you said, you seem to want to put together all these different philosophers under this umbrella of eudaimonia. But I don't really see how this is possible, and I don't see the usefulness of not distinguishing between Aristotelian and Stoic eudaimonia and Epicurean, because really, I don't see how this works. You have the features of eudaimonia, you say autonomy, and then you say independence from external, so another related to autonomy feature. And now if you read Epictetus, then he says, wish that things do not happen as you want, but wish that they happen as they do.
Yes.
And then you will be happy. So this is a very strange interpretation of autonomy and independence from external. So if you have to bend your mind to fit external factors, then this is not anymore independence from externals, right? And then we must say that Epictetus' concept of happiness is not the same like this eudaimonia you described, which includes autonomy and independence from externals.
Well, that's a big question, I think. I mean, if you think the way Epictetus begins his whole set of discourses, he starts off from the notion that there is just one thing that human beings have been granted as their special capacity, and that is what he calls the capacity to make good use of impressions. And they can't, I mean, their bodies are not fully, the person is not to identify simply with the body or with the circumstances, but it is this, it's the mindset which is the controlling feature for happiness. And so you may not like calling that autonomy, but I think the passage you mentioned, I mean, where he says, we shouldn't wish, we should go along. We should somehow not let circumstances determine our behaviour, but we should accept the circumstances and make the best use of them. That's not surely saying that the circumstances determine our happiness. It's quite the other way around, isn't it? I mean, isn't it saying that? I mean, you accept you've tried to do something, you failed to perhaps be successful, but the intention was there and the will was there, and that's the aspect of your situation that your happiness is premised on, your good efforts, your intention, the will. So I didn't quite understand why he thought the
Isn't the
circumstance.
whole idea of Stoic physics that you would not even attempt to do something of which you can predict that it goes against the laws of nature, including the psychological laws that govern the behavior of human beings. And so you wouldn't even try, right? You would, the wise man would know in advance, knowing physics and logic and ethics, that particular endeavors are not likely to succeed, and then he would not even try to embark on them.
Well, that's not. No, I don't quite agree with that. I mean, Epictetus says that he quotes Chrysippus saying, as long as the future is uncertain, and it is obviously uncertain for just about everybody. I mean, the wise man being something, more like an ideal than an actual. I go along with those values. I look after my health, I look after my children, and so forth. Now, something may happen, but you still have to have guidelines for your behaviour, and so you're not kind of trying to play catch up with destiny. I think you do the best you can, and Epictetus's philosophy would, I think, say that the best you can is the best you can do. Okay.
I just realized actually we started at 5:15, so we actually could go up there and ask the question. Because we started a little later. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
It was cutting off your question period here.
It's very short. Just, I think that this goes to what you were saying about the idea of eudaimon seem kind of inhuman. I guess it's always struck me as kind of boring too. I mean, it sounds like what were we put on this earth to do? Well, to get to the point where you're kind of like about everything. But I'm just wondering how widespread was this as an ideal among people in general then? I mean, I don't know if we know anything about that. And if it wasn't widespread, do you have any ideas why all the philosophers sort of congregated on this kind of picture of what happiness is?
Yeah, I mean, it's in a way relates to the point about Ulysses. I mean, surely there's something attractive about taking risks. Shouldn't we think of life as an adventure? Why should we want everything to be sort of put into a position where we can say, well, I was never disappointed because, I got my mindset. But that, yes, I can understand the worry about its being boring. I mean, I could give, I don't think I can give an interesting philosophical answer to why this kind of recipe was favoured, other than that experience of the world, which sort of took the kind of more, if you will, adventurous view, had so often brought about catastrophe. In other words, I think that may help to explain why philosophers like the Epicureans and the Stoics, although they're so different in some respects, all emphasized sort of untroubledness, undisturbed, unimpededness. I mean, those kind of notions, because the typical experience would be that people are constantly going to be hindered and impeded because they have certain kind of expectations and a different kind of value system. So I think how many people actually lived according to these philosophies, I think is a very interesting question. They were fairly well diffused, I think. I mean, for instance, if you take the Epicureans, Epicurus himself was flourishing around the year 300 BCE, and we discovered, about 100 years ago, a great Epicurean inscription which was set up in central Turkey, and that dates from about 200 AD. So I mean, you've got about 500 years of Epicureanism. Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, again, hanging out 450 years after Stoicism. So there's a long time frame. The way I tried to put it in the paper, I mean, the subdominant starting point here is is the kind of Socratic paradigm that the idea that you could become in some way take charge of your own life irrespective of circumstance. I think that there must have been something sort of seemingly heroic and challenging about that. I mean, Epicurus, I could have quoted, say, here is somebody, who was demonized, of course, later for his hedonism, but saying, in a letter that we survives of his, which he says, I write this to you. Well, actually, the Greek use of the past tense. He said, I wrote this to you on the last day of my life. The pain in my stomach, I think he had some kind of terrible blockage, is more intense than ever, but the memory of our friendship and conversations counterbalances that. So again, that's just one instance of how one of these philosophies could have been thought to have appeal. That you're setting up, sort of personal values, social values, friendship as a kind of counterweight to toothache or something like this. In that sense, I think it's not unreasonable, I think, to look at them in a somewhat homely way like that sometimes.
All right, let's see.